The night before land appeared, the Atlantic seemed endless, a black and breathing world beneath three fragile wooden ships. Their sails were swollen by wind, their hulls groaned under pressure, and every man aboard felt the ocean pulling them farther from home. Around them, there was no coastline, no harbor light, no church bell, no smell of earth, and no sign that the world they had known still existed. Spain had vanished behind them, swallowed by distance, memory, and fear. The sailors had been at sea for weeks, pushed west by winds that no longer felt like a blessing. At first, those winds had promised speed. Now they felt like a trap, carrying them deeper into a darkness no map could explain. Behind them were stone streets, crowded markets, wives, children, taverns, prayers, debts, familiar voices, and the certainty of land beneath their feet. Ahead of them was only black water, a horizon that refused to change, and a captain who insisted they continue. Every sound on the ship seemed louder at night, the snap of rope, the creaking of wooden ribs, the slap of waves against the hull, and the whisper of men who no longer trusted the man leading them. Some believed they had sailed too far. Some feared the ocean had no end. Others wondered if the same winds that carried them west would ever allow them to return east, or if the Atlantic had become a road with no way back. The compass behaved strangely. Seaweed floated in great fields across the water. Birds appeared, then vanished into the distance. Clouds formed, then dissolved. Every sign became a promise, and every broken promise made the fear harder to control. The men stared at the horizon until their eyes burned. They searched for branches, birds, smoke, clouds, anything that might mean land was near. But morning after morning, the sun rose over the same impossible truth: more ocean, more distance, more fear. On the largest ship, the Santa Maria, stood the man responsible for bringing them here. He was not a king, not a nobleman, and not even sailing toward the place he believed he would find. His name was Christopher Columbus. To some of his crew, Columbus was a visionary chosen by God. To others, he was a stubborn foreigner who had led them into death. To himself, he was a man of destiny, certain that fear was only the price of greatness. Columbus believed that beyond the Western Ocean lay Asia. Not a new continent, not unknown civilizations, not a world that would shatter European imagination, but the rich lands of the East described in maps, legends, and the stories of Marco Polo. He believed he was sailing toward gold, spices, silk, pearls, kingdoms, and the legendary wealth of Asia. But Columbus was wrong. His calculations were wrong. His map was wrong. His understanding of the planet was dangerously incomplete. He had underestimated the size of the Earth and overestimated how far Asia stretched eastward. Yet history does not always turn on perfect knowledge. Sometimes it turns on a mistake followed with enough courage, obsession, and power to change millions of lives. Columbus did not find what he was looking for. He found something far more consequential. Before sunrise, before the cry of land, before Spanish banners touched Caribbean sand, the future of the world was already turning in the wind. What began as a desperate gamble across the Atlantic would become one of the greatest turning points in human history. It would connect continents separated for thousands of years and begin a new age of movement, empire, trade, violence, survival, and transformation. It would create new empires, new economies, new foods, new maps, new languages, and new nations. But it would also bring disease, slavery, conquest, forced labor, cultural destruction, and death on a scale few in 1492 could have imagined. To understand why those three small ships were alone in the darkness, we must go backward, away from the Atlantic, away from the fear on deck, and away from the moment when one sailor would finally see land. We must return to the world before 1492, when Europe was restless, Asia was desired, Africa was being drawn into new systems of trade and violence, and the oceans were beginning to look less like barriers and more like roads. In the late 15th century, Europe was changing. The medieval world had not disappeared, but something new was rising inside it. Kingdoms were becoming more centralized, cities were growing, merchants were gaining influence, and royal ambition was reshaping power. Castles still watched from hillsides, nobles still defended ancient privileges, and churches still dominated the skyline of towns and villages. But the future was moving toward ports, markets, banks, ships, maps, and the men who could control long-distance trade. Whoever controlled trade could become rich. Whoever controlled the sea could bypass enemies, middlemen, and old limitations. Whoever found a new route to wealth could change not only his own kingdom, but the balance of power across Europe. And one kind of wealth obsessed European courts more than almost anything else: the wealth of Asia. Spices from the East were more than flavor. They were symbols of power, tools of preservation, imagined medicines, and treasures that could make merchants rich. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, silk, porcelain, perfumes, precious stones, dyes, carpets, and fine fabrics traveled across enormous distances before reaching European markets. Every object carried the mystery of lands most Europeans had never seen. These goods moved through vast networks of exchange. They crossed deserts, mountain passes, ports, caravans, and empires. They passed through the hands of merchants who spoke different languages, prayed to different gods, and served different rulers. The Silk Road was never one simple road. It was a vast web of routes connecting China, Central Asia, Persia, India, the Middle East, North Africa, and the Mediterranean, carrying goods, ideas, religions, technologies, stories, diseases, and knowledge. But every step added cost. By the time spices reached Europe, they had passed through many hands. Muslim merchants controlled important routes through the Middle East and North Africa, while Venetian traders dominated much of the Mediterranean trade. Venice grew rich because it understood a simple truth. Power did not only come from owning the product. Power came from standing between desire and supply, controlling the distance between what Europe wanted and where those treasures came from. If kings wanted spices, Venice could profit. If nobles wanted silk, Venice could profit. If Europe wanted the wonders of Asia, Venice stood in the middle. But other European powers were no longer satisfied with buying through someone else. Portugal, Spain, England, and France wanted access without permission. They wanted wealth without Venice, spices without middlemen, and a direct path to the source. Then, in 1453, one event deepened Europe's anxiety and changed its imagination. Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. The ancient city, once the heart of the Byzantine Empire and one of the great symbols of Christian power in the East, became the capital of a rising Ottoman world. The fall of Constantinople did not instantly close every trade route to Asia, as legend sometimes claims. Goods still moved, merchants still traded, and markets still functioned. But the event shook Christian Europe and made old routes feel vulnerable. It deepened fear and strengthened the belief that new paths were necessary. If land routes were expensive, dangerous, and controlled by rivals, perhaps the sea could become the road to Asia. Portugal would be the first to seriously test that idea. While Spain remained focused on its long war against Muslim Granada, Portuguese sailors explored the Atlantic and the western coast of Africa. Their voyages were not random acts of courage, but part of a long, patient strategy backed by royal ambition. Under Prince Henry the Navigator and those who followed him, Portugal built knowledge slowly and carefully. Sailors studied winds, currents, islands, coastlines, ship design, and navigation. Learning that the Atlantic had patterns that could be understood and used. Portuguese ships moved farther south along Africa's coast, step by step and generation by generation. They searched for gold, trade, Christian allies, and a way around Africa to the Indian Ocean, where the wealth of Asia might finally be reached. But exploration was never innocent. From the beginning, European expansion mixed curiosity with violence, faith with profit, navigation with exploitation. Portuguese traders built forts, made alliances, attacked rivals, and entered existing African trade networks. They also participated in and expanded the capture and sale of enslaved human beings. The ocean was becoming a road, but not only for goods. It was becoming a road for empire, forced labor, and the growing hunger of European states. In 1488, Bartholomew Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa. The storms were brutal and the distance terrifying, but the discovery was world-changing. The Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected, and Asia could be reached by sea. Portugal had found the outline of a route, south around Africa, then east toward India. But another idea was forming in the mind of a Genoese sailor, a dangerous idea that most experts considered unrealistic, perhaps even suicidal. What if Asia could be reached not by sailing around Africa, but by sailing west? Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa, a maritime city shaped by ships, merchants, bankers, sailors, mapmakers, and rumors from distant seas. Columbus was not born into royal power, nor was he raised to command kingdoms. But he grew up in a world where the sea promised escape from ordinary life, and where a man with enough ambition could imagine crossing into history. He sailed in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. He traveled to Portugal, lived among experienced navigators, married into a family connected to Atlantic exploration, and absorbed the dreams of an age obsessed with reaching Asia by sea. Columbus read travel accounts, studied maps, listened to sailors, and collected fragments of information. Then he turned those fragments into certainty. He was intelligent, disciplined, ambitious, deeply religious, and convinced that God had chosen him for something extraordinary. But he was also stubborn, and his greatest belief was also his greatest mistake. Educated Europeans in his time generally knew the earth was round. The real debate was not the shape of the earth, but its size. Columbus believed the planet was much smaller than it truly is. He also believed Asia extended much farther east than it actually does. In his mind, Japan, China, and the rich islands of the east were reachable across the Atlantic. His critics understood the danger. Portuguese experts rejected his plan because they believed the western distance to Asia was too great, and they were right. Without the Americas between Europe and Asia, Columbus and his crew might have vanished forever. But Columbus did not see impossibility. He saw destiny. He first brought his proposal to Portugal, where the court listened, examined his calculations, and turned him away because Portugal had already invested heavily in the African route. Columbus did not surrender. He searched for support elsewhere and eventually turned to Spain, where Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile were nearing the end of a war that had shaped the Iberian Peninsula for generations. For years, Columbus waited. Committees doubted him, scholars criticized him, and courtiers dismissed him. His demands were extraordinary: titles, authority, wealth, and a share of profits from lands he had not yet reached. He wanted to be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor of discovered lands, and beneficiary of future wealth. Many thought he was asking too much for a plan that might end in disaster. But timing is one of history's most powerful forces. In January 1492, Granada fell. The last Muslim kingdom in Iberia surrendered to Ferdinand and Isabella, completing the Reconquista and giving Spain a new sense of religious and royal destiny. Spain had just finished one long chapter of war, and now it looked outward. Portugal was already pushing around Africa. Spain needed a way to compete, and Columbus offered a gamble whose cost seemed small compared to its possible reward. In April 1492, the agreement was made. Columbus received the titles and privileges he had demanded if he succeeded. The dream was written into legal language. A vision became a contract, but parchment could not calm the sea. It could not shorten the Atlantic. It could not make wrong calculations correct. And it could not guarantee that the men who sailed with Columbus would ever see Spain again once they turned west into the unknown. On August 3, 1492, 3 ships left the port of Palos de la Frontera. They were not mighty imperial warships, but small, fragile vessels carrying a crew that could not possibly know their voyage would change the world. The Santa Maria was the largest, a slow and heavy vessel commanded by Columbus himself. The Pinta was faster, captained by Martín Alonso Pinzón, whose support was essential. The Nina was smaller and sturdy, and would prove remarkably reliable. These ships were not romantic objects of legend to the men who lived aboard them. They were cramped wooden worlds of sweat, salt, fear, rope, barrels, spoiled food, stale water, animals, prayers, arguments, and exhaustion. Men slept close together. Privacy almost did not exist. Food rotted, water grew foul, and the ocean soaked everything. A voyage like this was not only a test of navigation. It was a test of hunger, discipline, patience, and fear. At first, the route followed familiar waters. The ships sailed to the Canary Islands, repaired damage, gathered supplies, and waited for the right winds. Europe was still close enough to imagine, and return still felt possible. Then, from the Canaries, the ships turned west. This was the true beginning. The trade winds filled the sails and pushed them into the unknown, farther from land, farther from help, and farther from every map that gave comfort. Columbus kept two records of distance. One appears to have been closer to the true distance traveled. The other showed the crew a shorter distance, perhaps to calm them, perhaps to control them, perhaps to keep fear from turning into rebellion. Columbus had to manage not only sails and stars, but terror. The men watched the sea constantly. Floating weeds appeared in strange masses, birds passed overhead, the color of the water changed, and clouds gathered in ways that seemed meaningful. Each sign raised hope, and each disappointment made the fear worse. By late September and early October, the psychological pressure became dangerous. The sailors had crossed a boundary not on any map, but inside themselves. Behind them was no longer simply Spain. Behind them was life. Ahead of them was a promise that had not appeared, and Columbus stood between his dream and mutiny, forced to look certain even when the ocean gave no answers. He watched the sky, studied the birds, measured distance, interpreted signs, and insisted land was near. But belief does not silence hungry men, sweeten bad water, or erase the thought that every mile west might be 1 mile too far. Then the signs grew stronger. A branch with berries appeared. A carved piece of wood was seen. Birds flew with purpose. The ocean itself seemed to whisper that land was close, yet still the horizon remained dark and empty. On the night of October 11, 1492, the ships moved through darkness under a wide sky. Men stared into the black horizon. Every shadow could be land, every wave could be illusion, and every moment stretched like a held breath. Then, in the early hours of October 12, a cry broke the night. Land! On the Pinta, a sailor often identified as Rodrigo de Triana saw something rising from the sea, and after weeks of fear, the impossible became visible. At dawn, the men saw an island beneath the first light, green trees, pale sand, clear water, and birds moving above the shoreline. They had not reached the edge of death. They had reached a world. Columbus stepped ashore carrying banners for Spain. He gave thanks to God and claimed the island for Ferdinand and Isabella. To European eyes, it was discovery. But for the people already living there, this was not a new world. It was home. The island was known to its people as Guanahani. Columbus named it San Salvador. The people he encountered were Taino, part of a wide indigenous Caribbean world of villages, agriculture, canoes, trade, spiritual traditions, leaders, families, ceremonies, and memory. They were not people waiting outside history. They had their own history. Their communities cultivated cassava, maize, sweet potatoes, and other crops. They lived in villages led by caciques, traveled by canoe, traded, negotiated, worshipped, celebrated, and fought. Their world had politics, beauty, conflict, order, and meaning. Columbus did not understand that world. He saw the people before him through the lens of his own mission, possible converts, possible servants, possible subjects, and possible guides to gold. The first meeting was filled with curiosity, ceremony, misunderstanding, and danger hidden beneath smiles. The Taino saw strangers from the sea, pale faces, metal blades, strange clothes, wooden ships, unfamiliar gestures, and objects from another world. The Europeans saw people they believed could be ruled. From the beginning, wonder and possession walked together. Columbus believed he had reached islands near Asia, and he called the people Indians because he believed he was in the Indies. That mistake would echo for centuries, but his error was larger than a name. Columbus did not understand that between Europe and Asia lay two vast continents and countless islands, home to millions of people whose civilizations had developed without Europe. The Americas before European arrival were not empty. They were filled with languages, farms, cities, roads, markets, temples, villages, empires, alliances, wars, songs, laws, stories, sacred places, and human worlds of extraordinary complexity. Far to the west, in central Mexico, the Aztec Empire ruled from Tenochtitlan, a city built on an island in Lake Texcoco. Its causeways stretched across water, its markets drew thousands, and its temples rose above the lake. Tenochtitlan was one of the great cities of the world. Its rulers commanded tribute from many peoples, its power inspired loyalty and resentment, and its beauty and scale would later shock the Europeans who entered it. In the forests and highlands of Mesoamerica, Maya communities continued traditions of farming, writing, astronomy, trade, religion, and political life that reached back centuries. The great classic Maya cities had changed, but Maya civilization had not vanished. Across the Andes, the Inca Empire stretched over mountains, deserts, valleys, and coastlines. Its roads climbed through impossible landscapes, its messengers ran vast distances, and its storehouses, terraces, and administrative systems connected millions under imperial rule. Beyond the empires were countless other societies: farmers, fishers, hunters, traders, towns, confederacies, villages, and nations whose histories cannot be reduced to one image. This was the world Columbus had entered without understanding it. He searched for Asia in a place that was not Asia. He listened for words that might sound like names from Marco Polo. He looked for gold before he understood the people, forcing reality to fit the map inside his head. The first voyage continued through the Bahamas, Cuba, and Hispaniola. Columbus admired the beauty of the islands, the harbors, the forests, the clear waters, and the people he met, but his admiration was never separate from ownership. Again and again, his thoughts turned toward gold, conversion, labor, and royal authority. He noticed small gold ornaments and demanded to know where the metal came from. He believed the people he met could be made servants of the Spanish crown. Columbus took several indigenous people with him, hoping they could serve as guides, translators, and proof of his voyage. 2. Columbus, they were evidence. To their families and communities, they were people taken from home into an unknown world. On Christmas Day, 1492, disaster struck. The Santa Maria ran aground off Hispaniola and could not be saved. Its timber was used to build a small settlement called La Navidad, the first Spanish foothold in the Caribbean. Columbus left men there before returning to Spain. La Navidad was meant to be a promise, that Columbus would return, that Spain would claim more, and that the islands would become the beginning of a larger imperial future. But the men left behind were not peaceful guests. Driven by greed, separated from discipline, and surrounded by people they did not understand or respect, they demanded gold, took what they wanted, and turned fragile contact into violence. When Columbus returned, La Navidad was gone. The settlement had been destroyed, and the men he left behind were dead. The dream of easy empire had met resistance, consequence, and blood on the very shores Columbus had claimed. But by then, the story had already reached Spain. Columbus returned in 1493 carrying captured indigenous people, parrots, unfamiliar plants, ornaments, and stories of islands across the ocean. He had not brought the spices of Asia, but he had brought proof. He had not found the court of the Great Khan, nor had he reached Japan or China. But he had brought proof of lands beyond the Atlantic, and for Ferdinand and Isabella, that possibility was too great to ignore. Spain celebrated him. Bells rang, crowds gathered, and the royal court listened. Columbus presented himself as the man who had opened a western route to the Indies, a servant of God, a messenger of empire, and a symbol of possibility. But beneath the celebration was uncertainty. Where exactly had he been? Why had he not found the great cities of Asia? Where were the spices? Where was the vast gold? The answers were unclear, but the opportunity was too large to dismiss. The second voyage was different. This was no longer a small experiment with 3 ships. In 1493, Columbus sailed again with a much larger fleet, carrying settlers, soldiers, priests, animals, tools, seeds, weapons, and royal orders. Exploration had become occupation. Horses, pigs, cattle, wheat, vines, metal tools, crosses, and European ambitions crossed the Atlantic. The men who came did not come only to look. They came to build, extract, convert, command, and rule. For the Taino, uncertainty turned into catastrophe. Demands for gold increased, forced labor spread, violence became common, villages were disrupted, leaders were pressured, and resistance was punished. Columbus was not only a navigator anymore. He was a colonial governor. In that role, he proved harsh, unstable, and often brutal. The colony struggled with hunger, rebellion, greed, disease, and conflict among the Spaniards themselves. Many settlers expected wealth quickly, and when it did not appear, pressure fell on indigenous communities. Tribute systems demanded gold dust, cotton, food, and labor. For the Taino, life was being reorganized by force. Work that once served families, leaders, rituals, and communities was redirected toward foreign demands backed by steel and royal authority. The Spanish crown would later develop the encomienda system, granting colonists claims to indigenous labor and tribute under the language of protection and Christian instruction. In practice, it often became coercion, abuse, hunger, exhaustion, and deadly exploitation. Missionaries arrived with crosses and prayers. Some would later condemn the brutality they witnessed, while others participated in the destruction of indigenous spiritual worlds. Conversion was rarely separate from conquest, and salvation was often carried beside punishment. But the most devastating force was invisible. European diseases crossed the Atlantic with sailors, settlers, animals, clothes, supplies, and breath. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other infections entered populations with no previous exposure and little immunity. Disease moved faster than armies. It traveled from village to village, island to island, and eventually deep into continents where many people died before ever seeing a European face. It killed leaders, broke families, emptied homes, and shattered memory. The population collapse in the Caribbean was catastrophic. The Taino world Columbus first encountered was ravaged by forced labor, violence, hunger, displacement, and disease. This was not simply a tragic side effect of discovery. It was colonial transformation through catastrophe. Yet indigenous peoples did not simply disappear. They resisted, fled, negotiated, adapted, and survived. Their descendants and cultures continued despite centuries of violence and erasure, because history is not only the story of conquest, but also the story of endurance. Columbus would make 4 voyages across the Atlantic. He reached islands of the Caribbean, parts of Central America, and the northern coast of South America, yet until the end, he clung to the belief that he had reached lands connected to Asia. He saw rivers and imagined they might lead to paradise. He saw coastlines and tried to fit them into old maps. He found a world that contradicted him, and still refused to fully understand what he had found. Others began to see what Columbus could not. Amerigo Vespucci and other explorers argued that these lands were not Asia, but something separate in European understanding. Slowly, a new continent entered European maps and European imagination. The name America would come not from Columbus, but from Amerigo. Cartographers placed the name on maps, and the word spread across Europe. The world was being redrawn, but maps were never neutral. They were instruments of imagination, business, religion, and power. A line drawn in Europe could become a claim over people who had never heard of the king whose name was written across their homeland. The Caribbean became the base from which Spain pushed outward. It became a laboratory of conquest, settlement, forced labor, religious conversion, and imperial rule. From these islands, expeditions moved toward Mexico, Central America, and South America. The wealth Columbus had failed to find in great quantities would later appear in forms even more dramatic than he imagined: silver mines, conquered empires, forced labor systems, cities built on ruins, and royal treasure fleets crossing the Atlantic. In 1519, Hernán Cortés entered the world of the Aztec Empire. He did not arrive with a massive army, but with a small force, steel weapons, horses, firearms, ambition, and a dangerous talent for exploiting political divisions. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not simply Europeans defeating indigenous people. It was a complex war involving Spanish violence, indigenous allies, imperial resentment, disease, strategy, betrayal, and survival, all unfolding inside one of the great cities of the world. Many indigenous groups who had suffered under Aztec domination saw the Spanish as dangerous but useful allies. They did not know that helping destroy one empire would help create another, one that would soon claim their lands as well. In the Andes, Francisco Pizarro and his men entered an Inca world weakened by civil war and disease. The capture of Atahualpa and the seizure of imperial wealth opened another chapter of conquest, betrayal, and colonial transformation. These later conquests were not Columbus's voyages, but they were connected to the door his crossing had opened. After 1492, the Atlantic was no longer a wall between worlds. It became a bridge carrying everything history could move. Across that bridge moved soldiers, settlers, priests, enslaved people, animals, crops, silver, weapons, laws, languages, diseases, and ideas. This vast movement is known as the Columbian Exchange, one of the largest biological and cultural transformations in human history. From Europe, Africa, and Asia came horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens, wheat, rice, sugarcane, coffee, and countless weeds, insects, and microbes. These arrivals changed landscapes, diets, warfare, transportation, labor systems, and economies across the Americas. Horses transformed many indigenous societies, especially in the grasslands of North America, where they later reshaped hunting, travel, warfare, diplomacy, and power. Cattle and sheep changed land use, pigs spread rapidly, and European animals remade environments. Sugarcane became one of the most profitable and brutal crops in the Atlantic world. To grow it, empires demanded land, water, mills, capital, and labor on a massive scale, turning islands and coastlines into engines of wealth and suffering. From the Americas came maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, tobacco, beans, peppers, squash, peanuts, vanilla, and many other crops. These foods crossed oceans and entered kitchens, fields, markets, and empires far from their origins. The potato, first cultivated in the Andes, became one of the most important foods in Europe. It grew in poor soils, fed dense populations, and helped support demographic growth, changing the history of Ireland, Russia, and beyond. Maize spread into Africa, Europe, and Asia. Tomatoes became central to Mediterranean cooking, though they had not existed there before. Cacao became chocolate, tobacco became a global addiction, and chili peppers transformed cuisines from India to China to West Africa. The Columbian Exchange created abundance and catastrophe together. It fed millions and killed millions. It created new cuisines, new fortunes, new empires, and new systems of exploitation. The world became more connected, but the connection was never equal. Silver from the Americas reshaped the global economy. Mines such as Potosí in the Andes produced vast quantities of silver through forced labor and deadly conditions. That silver crossed oceans, financed empires, paid soldiers, and bought Asian goods. A mountain in South America could influence merchants in Manila, bankers in Seville, and markets in Ming China. The modern world economy was taking shape, but its foundations were soaked in suffering, extraction, coercion, and death. As indigenous populations collapsed under disease, violence, and forced labor, European colonizers searched for new sources of labor. The Atlantic slave trade expanded into one of the most horrific systems in human history. Millions of Africans were captured, sold, marched to coasts, imprisoned in forts, and forced onto ships across the Middle Passage. They were transported into plantations, mines, households, and colonial economies built on extraction and racial slavery. This slavery did not begin with Columbus, and it did not belong to one nation alone. But the Atlantic world created after 1492 gave it new scale, new geography, and new economic power tied to sugar, tobacco, cotton, silver, and empire. The ocean that had terrified Columbus's sailors became a highway of wealth and death. Ships carried treasure east, enslaved people west, soldiers across, missionaries outward, and letters back to courts hungry for reports of land, labor, and profit. Spain rose rapidly as a global empire. Its claims stretched across the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, large parts of South America, and eventually across the Pacific to the Philippines, linking the Spanish monarchy to a world larger than medieval kings had imagined. Portugal, already moving around Africa, built its own global network through Africa, Brazil, India, and Asia. The Treaty of Tordesillas divided Spanish and Portuguese claims with a line drawn across the map, as if distant peoples could be divided by ink. But England, France, and the Netherlands would not remain spectators forever. They challenged Iberian power, attacked treasure fleets, founded colonies, traded, raided, enslaved, and fought for pieces of the Atlantic world that Columbus's crossing had helped reveal. The center of European power began to shift. For centuries, the Mediterranean had been one of the great arenas of trade and empire. After Columbus, the Atlantic became one of the central stages of world history. Ports facing the ocean grew in importance. Seville, Lisbon, Bristol, London, Bordeaux, Amsterdam, and later many others tied their fortunes to ships crossing the sea. Wealth moved through harbors, banks, warehouses, insurance houses, royal treasuries, and markets. Maps changed. Blank spaces became coastlines. Legends slowly gave way to measured latitudes, harbors, rivers, and colonial names. Cartography became a weapon, because to draw a coast was to imagine control. To name a place was to claim it. To place a flag on a map was to ignore the people already living there. The transformation was not only political or economic. It was also spiritual, cultural, and deeply human. Europeans carried Christianity across the ocean with missionary zeal. Churches rose over indigenous sacred places. Baptisms, missions, schools, and religious courts became tools of conversion, education, discipline, and control inside the expanding colonial world. But indigenous peoples did not simply surrender their worlds. They resisted with weapons, flight, diplomacy, rebellion, adaptation, and memory. They preserved languages, blended traditions, challenged colonial rule, and survived inside and against systems designed to transform them. Africans forced into the Atlantic world also resisted. They preserved spiritual traditions, created new cultures, escaped plantations, formed maroon communities, rebelled against enslavers, and shaped the Americas in music, food, religion, language, labor, and survival. The world after Columbus was not made by Europeans alone. It was made by conquest and resistance, by forced migration and adaptation, by indigenous survival, African endurance, European ambition, and the unpredictable mixing of worlds. Columbus's own final years were far from the simple glory often imagined. He faced accusations of misrule, was arrested and returned to Spain in chains, and fought to defend his titles, wealth, and reputation. The man celebrated as Admiral of the Ocean Sea became a symbol of both triumph and failure. He died in 1506 still believing, or still insisting, that he had reached lands connected to Asia. He never fully understood the scale of what his voyage had begun. Few people in history have been so wrong and so consequential at the same time, so mistaken in destination and yet so powerful in consequence. To some, Columbus became a heroic explorer, the man who crossed an unknown ocean and connected hemispheres. To others, he became a symbol of invasion, enslavement, disease, and colonial violence. Memory still fights over his name. Statues rise, statues fall, holidays are celebrated, and holidays are renamed. But history is more difficult than a statue or a slogan. Columbus was brave, ambitious, skilled, stubborn, religious, visionary, and wrong. He was also capable of brutality, exploitation, and cruelty. His voyage opened one of history's most important and destructive chapters. The so-called discovery of America was never simply the finding of land. It was the collision of worlds. It brought together continents that had developed separately for millennia, and the impact changed every side of the meeting. Europe gained wealth, crops, land, power, and global reach, but also built empires rooted in conquest and forced labor. The Americas were transformed by disease, colonization, resistance, cultural blending, and survival under unimaginable pressure. Africa was pulled into a vast Atlantic system of slavery that devastated societies and carried millions into bondage. Asia was drawn into the flow of silver, trade, and global exchange. No continent remained untouched. Before 1492, humanity lived in connected regions, but not in one truly global system. After Columbus, oceans became roads. Diseases became global forces. Crops crossed hemispheres. Empires reached overseas. Economies began to bind distant lives together. A miner in the Andes, a merchant in Seville, and a farmer in Ireland were pulled into the same widening storm. A trader in West Africa, a silver broker in China, and an indigenous survivor in the Caribbean were also connected by the same new world. That is why this voyage matters, not because one man found an empty land. He did not. And not because one moment created the modern world alone, because history is never that simple. It matters because it marked a turning point from separation to collision, from distant worlds to a shared global history. Imagine again those ships in the night, the sails straining against the wind, the men staring into darkness, and the captain convinced that Asia lay ahead. None of them could see the future waiting beyond the horizon. They could not see the fall of empires, the spread of smallpox, the silver mines, the slave ships, the plantations, the missionary bells, the burning settlements, the crowded ports, the new foods, the new wars, or the new world economy. They could not see cities that would rise across the Americas, languages that would merge, peoples that would survive, nations that would be born, and histories that would be written in blood, faith, ambition, and endurance. On that first morning in the Caribbean, sunlight touched the beach, the trees, the water, and the faces of strangers looking at strangers. For a brief moment, before conquest took shape, there was wonder, uncertainty, and fragile silence. But history does not pause in wonder. The ships had arrived, the claims had been made, and the ocean had been crossed. From that moment forward, the Atlantic was no longer a barrier between worlds. It was the road between them. The discovery of America was not a single event frozen in 1492. It was the beginning of centuries of movement, violence, exchange, empire, survival, and change. It created unimaginable wealth and unimaginable suffering. It made the modern world possible, but not innocent. Its legacy lives in borders, languages, religions, foods, populations, inequalities, memories, and debates that continue today. To speak of Columbus is to speak of crossing and consequence. To speak of America's discovery is also to speak of the people who were already there. The voyage began with fear in the dark, with sailors wondering whether they would ever see home again. It ended by changing what home meant for people on every continent. After Columbus crossed the Atlantic, humanity would never again live in separate worlds. The oceans had been opened, the maps had been redrawn, and the age of global history had begun. And from that age, there would be no return.